Well, good afternoon everyone and welcome to our webinar on conducting a disciplinary investigation. We were delighted at the response to this actually, and it's interesting because so many people undertake training on disciplinary meetings and disciplinary hearings, and the investigation, the first stage in the procedure, is very often overlooked. So it was heartwarming to see how many people were interested in learning more about this topic. My name is Alison Blackhurst and I'm the HR Knowledge Manager at HR Solutions, and I will be leading the seminar this afternoon. And I'm joined by my colleague Sue Watson, who is our HR Operations Manager. Good afternoon, Sue.
Good afternoon, Alison, and hello to everybody there. I'm here to make sure things keep running smoothly, hopefully. If you do have any technical problems or any questions relating to the webinar, then do send them through. You can use your side panel where there is a questions and a chat box, and I will try and respond to them. If we do have any time at the end of the webinar, we will try and answer one or two questions, but if we don't get a chance to answer yours, then please do send them through and we'll respond to you directly afterwards. And if you would like a copy of the slides, then just let us know and we can send them through to you as well. Thank you. Over to you, Alison.
Oh, great. Okay, fine. So, conducting disciplinary investigations, what's it all about? Well, we normally start by looking at the legal background to the topics that we're dealing with, but there is no actual law that deals with disciplinary investigations. So what we turn to is the Acas Code of Practice. This isn't law, as I said, but it is a useful benchmark for tribunals and employers, and it does actually set out what is considered to be a fair procedure. Now, the code itself is short. There are only 10 pages of it. And what it says in terms of investigations are just these three bullets that you can see on the slide. So, first of all, issues should be dealt with promptly. Now, note it says promptly. It doesn't say any deadlines or timescales or anything like that. It just effectively says get on with it. Yeah. It also says that employers should act consistently. So you do need to consider previous cases as well as the one in hand. And it says that appropriate investigations should be made. Well, what is appropriate? And effectively, what they're meaning there is really, an investigation that is proportionate to the issue and the seriousness of the case. Now, the Code of Practice is supplemented by guidance, and what the guidance actually also says is that ideally you are looking at 3 people in this process. You're a neutral person to undertake the investigations, so somebody who will not be in charge of the disciplinary hearing, somebody else altogether. So you have your disciplinary investigator, you have the person who will hold the disciplinary hearing, and then ideally appeals will be heard by a further different person where possible. And I think we have to bear in mind that this is not always practical in a small organisation, but for example that's when people like us may well be invited to come in and actually do the investigations for you before handing the information over to your disciplining manager. So, disciplinary investigations. Well, key things for this, first of all, speed. For misconduct offences, an investigation should be done promptly. First of all, before memories fade or get distorted, and also we don't want any witnesses or managers or staff discussing the matter and being influenced or colluding with one another, and then when you actually come to talk to them you find that their memory is actually very different from the version of events that they would have actually given to you at the time. We're also looking for comprehensive and professional notes, and it is amazing how we still get handed over pieces of paper torn from a pad which are all rough with handwritten notes where first names are known but no surnames or job titles, and we don't have the dates on it and things like this. Notes of all meetings should be comprehensive and professional, and they should clearly establish what's based on fact and what are the opinions of witnesses. Note that these notes may be used in the disciplinary hearing, So again, they could be given to the employee as part of that. They may be used at any appeal, and certainly if an issue is so serious that you end up with a dismissal and it goes to tribunal, then if it goes that far, your notes actually may well be brought out in tribunal. So they do need to be appropriately written and presented, even at this stage. So we're looking for no doodles and scribbled comments and remarks that you wouldn't actually want the rest of the world to see. Now, the process also should be confidential, and I think we have to stress that the aim of this is really to reduce the negative impact at a very early stage. Because, of course, once you start doing the investigation, it may turn out that your employees are totally innocent of what they are alleged to have done, and that there's a completely plausible story for, as to why they didn't do what you thought they had done. Or it could be that they're very naive and that actually the reason for any misconduct might not be deliberate wrongdoing, but just that they actually weren't aware of the rules or that they did things wrongly. So we don't want the rest of the world knowing about all of this, because we want to keep the working relationships sound and good for as long as possible. And we also want to minimize the risk of witnesses altering their evidence on the basis of discussions with other colleagues. So the existence or the nature of the complaint shouldn't be communicated to anybody other than those who need to know. And finally, the investigator should always bear in mind what this is all about. What is the aim? And the aim of the disciplinary procedure fundamentally is to correct. It's to put things right. It's not to punish people. So the idea is to get everyone working to acceptable standards. So are the rules known? Are they applied fairly to everybody? Do staff know about them? Those are the sort of questions that you may well be asking as part of a disciplinary investigation. So step one, first of all, is to appoint an investigator. And I really can't emphasize how important this role is. It's absolutely crucial. So it isn't something that you just give out to a junior member of staff who is thinking about possibly having a career in HR long term, yeah? Because this person will actually lay the foundation for the whole of what goes on after that. And also they will set the tone for the entire process. So if they don't take it seriously, or if they don't appear to have the appropriate authority, or if they do a bad job, or if they destroy evidence, then they're going to make it so much harder for the disciplining manager to deal with things properly and to get things back on track. Now, the role of the investigator is actually quite a simple one, really. It's easier to say than do, of course, but the role is just to establish the facts prior to the employee attending a disciplinary hearing if there is a case to answer. So somebody who is impartial and somebody who will be fair and who will ensure that the investigation is entirely neutral. And the job is, it's not a Sherlock Holmes job to look for, to find the criminal, yeah? It's to look for evidence that either supports or contradicts the allegation. So it's both things, it's equally weighted, yeah? You're trying to establish the facts and to decide what did or did not happen. And the investigator is not expected to prove that an employee was guilty. All the person has to do is to determine whether or not there appears to be a case. As I said, easier said than done. So who should do this? Well, you're going to see this is a paragon of virtue by the time I'm finished, but it has to be somebody who is mature enough and senior enough to set an appropriate tone, and who will make it clear that this is an important part of the process and that the employee will actually be listened to. Somebody who will stress the fairness of the process and who will not allow a disciplinary investigation to turn into a disciplinary hearing, because the two should be kept entirely separate. We're looking for somebody who's going to be fair and objective, and also who will handle the meetings in a reasonable and calm manner, but who will have the confidence to stand their own ground and to ask questions and to listen and to wait to see if any more evidence appears and to probe and to be persistent and keep on asking questions until they're satisfied that they've actually got as much information as they're likely to get. Now, the more complex the case, the more detailed the investigation will need to be. So there's a whole range of investigations, and we can't cover everything here, but at one end of the spectrum you will have straightforward cases such as repeated lateness or high levels of absence, where, to be honest, the investigation is going to be a very, very straightforward, simple job which will just involve collating and examining records or timesheets, particularly if everything is done electronically and therefore, you know, the facts are likely to be accurate. Yeah? In other cases, an investigation may require prior technical knowledge of equipment or processes or procedures, particularly where these are alleged not to have been followed. We need somebody that will understand that and that will make good and accurate records, because we want the records to be comprehensive so that nothing comes out at a later stage that was said during the investigation but not included in the reports, and we also want them to be accurate. So somebody who's quite diligent and thorough and who won't just do half a job and hope that they can get away with that. Very often you'll find in these situations that your gut feeling is saying, something's not quite right here. I wonder if everybody does this. Now, the person that fails to follow up on things like that, that's when things go wrong, actually. So we don't want someone that will do half a job. We want someone that will listen to those warning bells in their head and that will think, yeah, maybe I ought to check this up as well. We want to make sure that they will keep things confidential themselves and that they can be trusted to do so, because what they are tasked with investigating may turn out just to be a storm in a teacup, in which case the fewer people know the better, because the employee may turn out to be entirely innocent of any wrongdoing, or it may well be that there are health or personal issues or other things that actually explain why they behaved the way they did, and we don't want the rest of the world to know about that. And as I said earlier, we also want to minimize the risk of witnesses altering their evidence because they've been discussing things with other colleagues who've told them other things, which puts a different slant on it and therefore changes their opinions. And finally, we need someone who's going to keep the investigation to a tight timescale and who will keep to a deadline. Now, it is no good choosing somebody who's just about to go on holiday to do a disciplinary investigation, because the idea is that it should be done promptly. And it's also no good giving it to somebody who's so overworked already that they're going to start the job and then get diverted onto other tasks. So as I said, we're looking for the perfect person here, but this is an important job. It's just, it's one that is so often overlooked, but actually it is key to the disciplinary hearing. And if an investigator does their job really well, then they are making the job of the disciplining manager so much easier. Now, who shouldn't do it in that case? Well, first of all, let's remember that the investigator should be fair and objective, not only in reality and in the eyes of the managers, but also in the eyes of the employee and also in the eyes of other staff. So if you are given the job of undertaking a disciplinary investigation, then could we suggest that you withdraw if any of the following bullets apply? Firstly, if the employee has made a complaint against you personally, then it's going to be tantamount to being impossible for you to be fair and objective, because of course you already feel defensive against that person. If you're involved yourself with the allegation as a witness or somebody who's complained about the behaviour or who has reported the behaviour, then you shouldn't be doing the investigation. You also shouldn't be investigating if you are involved with the employee in any way, i.e. you're a close friend of theirs or you're a relative. And you shouldn't do it if you're going to get emotionally involved, because you're going to mess everything up for everybody that comes after you. If you are too angry to be objective, or you're too emotionally involved either in defending the employee, or you get so upset about the nature of the misconduct that has happened, you may have particularly strong views, for example, about abuse of children or vulnerable adults or drug taking or whatever. Now, if you're going to get emotionally involved, then really you shouldn't be doing the investigation. And finally, you need to understand the issues being investigated. Now, if it's a simple one like timekeeping, then pretty well anyone is going to be able to do that because we all understand what late is, providing we know what the starting time is and when the person turned up. But an investigation into allegations of fraudulent accounting procedures, for example, may require some prior technical knowledge of what should be done and how it should be done. So it's horses for courses, effectively, when you're appointing an investigator. Now, step 2 really is to properly scope out the investigation. So first of all, are we looking at performance, poor performance, or are we looking at misconduct? Now, the distinction will not necessarily alter what's investigated, but the label given to those allegations will set the tone and inform the whole of the rest of the process. So let's be clear what we are talking about here. Secondly, how complex is the issue? Because the more complex the case, the more detailed the investigation will need to be. As I said earlier, in cases like repeated lateness, it might just be a case of getting timesheets. Yeah? When you get the timesheets, it may well be that you want to have a brief discussion with the employee to establish the facts and to check out that actually those records are correct and they are accurate. But a more detailed investigation could well involve talking to witnesses, getting lots and lots of different documents, possibly checking things out, the involvement of external bodies such as the police. So a totally different ballgame altogether, and something that's going to take a lot more time to do. And the objective in all of these is to establish the facts and to provide sound evidence for any subsequent disciplinary action. So how serious is this? And if dismissal is likely to result, or if the allegations may prevent an employee from working in their role in the future, or may relate to a criminal offence, then you are going to be far more detailed and thorough. Now there's a case, Salford NHS Trust versus Roldham, which gave us guidance that the more serious the consequences of a dismissal, the more careful the investigation should be. And in that particular case, dismissal would have actually meant that the employee would be deported, so pretty serious. Timescale? Well, that's going to depend on the seriousness and complexity of the investigation, but clearly it is a case of getting on with these quickly. You can't just let them drift, yeah? So to whom, how, and by when should the investigation report be delivered? If you clarify all of that up front, then at least the parameters are set as to what the job is actually going to involve. Now, if we're looking at misconduct, which tends to be the case for most disciplinary investigations, to be honest, yeah, you have a whole spectrum here. So it could range from lateness, failure to follow a reasonable management instruction, through to more complicated things like abusing computer systems or internet access, where you're having to do far more digging around what has actually been done, through to really difficult cases like bullying and harassment, where it may well be one person's word against another and it is very, very difficult to work out what really happened, through to issues such as theft, fighting, or criminal offences. So we have a range of misconduct, and the level of the investigation should actually reflect that. It should cover the precise allegations and establish the details. First of all, what happened? Where did it happen, and when did it happen? Trying to get a full picture of that. Now, who was involved in this incident? Was it just internal staff who you have easy access to? Or also were clients there, or customers, suppliers, residents? Was anybody else involved in this in any way? Now, what are the rules? Were the correct procedures or rules followed? Yeah? And if not, why not? Why did this happen? Yeah? Were there any witnesses to what happened? And if so, who were they? Were other employees doing the same thing, or was it just this one individual? Because bear in mind, we will need consistency of treatment. You can't treat two employees who did exactly the same misdemeanor in a different way unless you can justify why you should do that. Has anything similar happened in the past? If so, what happened and why? And what was done about it? And what was the risk to the business? What were the consequences? Now, you don't have to have a serious accident before you take a breach of your health and safety rules very seriously. It is enough to say this could have led to something really, really serious. Yeah? And finally, are there any personal issues that may have a bearing on this issue? And what we mean by that are things like health conditions or a disability, stress, personal problems, immaturity in very many cases. Has the employee received any previous warnings for the same type of issue? So generally speaking, for misconduct, that's the sort of starting point for all of this. Poor performance is actually quite a difficult one to deal with because it can be very subjective, but the timing might not be so much of an issue here because very often you're talking about poor performance that has built up over some time, so it's not crucial to deal with it immediately. It's just a case of you need to take action before it gets worse in order to rectify the situation. So an investigation into poor performance is going to concentrate much more on establishing the nature of the shortfalls in performance and to be looking for possible reasons for these. So does the employee know what is required and expected? Do they have a clear job description? Do they have clear tasks? Have they had proper training and instruction to do those roles? Do they have the appropriate tools and equipment? And do these work properly? And do other employees have problems with the tools and equipment? Is there a particular distinction between this employee and other people doing the same job? Are there any personal issues which might have led to somebody who was performing perfectly adequately before, their performance deteriorating in any way? And in terms of shortfall in performance, it may well be that the employee is very aware of this, or it might be performance that has actually gone downhill over quite some period of time, and in which case you're going to have to persuade the employee that they are not or no longer performing to the standards that they once were, in which case examples of poor work or missed deadlines, of errors, customer complaints, lower productivity, that sort of thing. That is going to be important evidence for that. Now, before we go any further, we need to consider very carefully whether an employee should be suspended during an investigation. And where we are looking at potential gross misconduct and where summary dismissal may be an outcome, then that's normally going to be appropriate. And employers who have insurance policies which cover them against tribunal claims and things like that, you may well find that it's absolutely essential that you suspend in this particular instance, because otherwise how can you possibly defend your stance that the person did something that was so bad that you absolutely couldn't even conceive of carrying on with their employment, if in reality you've let it go for a few months and they've carried on working perfectly normally. So do consider whether we're looking at suspension, but do bear in mind that suspension does not imply guilt. Now, if you're going to suspend, the suspension should happen without delay, and the period of suspension should be kept as short as possible, and the employee should be told that the outcome of a disciplinary hearing is not a foregone conclusion. Yep. So suspension may well be appropriate if there's a threat to your business or to other employees, or if the very fact of the employee being at work means that could hinder your fair and impartial investigation. So the employee may well tamper with the evidence, or may well try to destroy things and remove things off computers, or may collude with witnesses and suggest that things didn't happen the way the witness thought it did, or influence them, or worse, might even actually threaten your witnesses. So, you know, if you think that any of those things could happen, then suspension for a short period may be appropriate. And finally, if you are concerned about the employee repeating the misconduct in question, then you may well feel that it's better to keep them out of the workforce and unable to do that until you've actually dealt with this instance. So suspension should happen quickly, but it is a last resort and it shouldn't be a knee-jerk reaction. It's not an automatic thing that you do immediately you're faced with a problem. The question is, can you remove the risk, for example, by temporarily moving the employee onto other duties or to other work or a different department or supervisor, or by removing some of the key tasks until the outcome of the hearing is decided, or even just increasing the amount of direct supervision may do the trick. Now, any of these may be sufficient and may, first of all, be more cost effective for you because, of course, suspension is on full pay and benefits because it's not a disciplinary sanction. But more importantly, these may make it easier for the employee to return to work afterwards if in fact the outcome is no disciplinary hearing or a disciplinary warning short of dismissal. So do think very carefully before suspension. If you do suspend, then you would write to the employee to confirm that this isn't a prejudgment and to ensure that they do understand this and to give them the reasons for the suspension and an idea of how long this is likely to last for. And also it's a good idea to give the name of a specified contact person in case of any queries, because somebody who is sitting, okay, on full pay, but still sitting at home worrying about whether a potential disciplinary hearing is going to happen and whether they are likely to be dismissed, is also likely to start doing a little bit themselves or to want to do a little bit themselves to prepare their defence. So it may well be that they're also asking, I need to talk to X to find out their stance on this. I need to check whether employees do follow this procedure. I would need a copy of some of these policies. I would like a copy of my contract, please. Those sort of questions. So normally a nominated person, such as an HR representative or a line manager, will be the contact point. Now, an employee who is suspended on full pay should be available to attend meetings during working hours, obviously, because they should be at your disposal still. But the period of suspension should be kept short, and if the reason for it was simply to prevent the employee from tampering with any evidence, then once you have that evidence, you will have some view as to how serious the situation may be. And it may be appropriate to ask the employee to return to work prior to any disciplinary hearing, particularly if you think it could well be that a dismissal is not necessarily going to take place. And that might be better than retaining the employee on suspension until you actually make a decision. It needs to be a balanced decision. Think very carefully about it. So we have scoped out the investigation and what needs to be looked at, and we've decided whether to suspend or not. The next step normally will be to start with the employee, because if you bear in mind from the employee's point of view, the last thing that they want to do is to hear from their colleagues that an investigation has been taken in place into something that they are alleged to have done. So tell the employee of the investigation and give them a summary of the allegations against them, and it's usually to talk to them first unless the case is so complex that you really need to do a bit more digging beforehand in order to understand what it's all about. Now, this is a formal meeting, but there are no rules in the sense of right to be accompanied or a certain amount of time given to prepare or anything like that. Yeah. So the first thing would be normally to ask for no interruptions and to actually outline what the meeting is about and to ask that mobiles are turned off during the meeting. You might want to put a sign on your door which actually says no interruptions. Yeah. People sometimes will ask if they can record the meeting, or sometimes the disciplinary investigator will actually want to allow a recording because it enables them then to concentrate on what the person is saying and the questions that they're asking. So this is very much personal choice at this stage, but clearly if you are going to record a disciplinary investigation, then it should be with the permission of everyone concerned. Now, this is a confidential meeting, so it's sensible to stress this to the employee and to suggest that it really isn't a good idea for them to go and tell all and sundry about this as soon as they leave the room, because it may well be that the whole thing is actually resolved fairly quickly. Hold it in a private venue, normally during working hours, but if the employee prefers to hold it outside of normal working hours or away from the workplace, then do think about that, because that's all about maintaining respect and dignity and saving face effectively. So the employee needs to know that at this stage it's purely an investigation, it is not a disciplinary hearing, and the meeting is not part of your disciplinary procedure. So do you allow that person to be accompanied by a fellow worker or a trade union representative? Now, this is best practice, but actually the statutory right to be accompanied doesn't come into effect until the disciplinary hearing itself. So the employee is not entitled to bring somebody with them. So it's a case of actually just stepping back again and being reasonable and thinking, well, is that sensible? And it might be if the employee is disabled and needs assistance, or for example if you have foreign workers where English is not their first language, and having somebody there who can help to interpret and to resolve any areas of confusion in the dialogue may well be very, very sensible. So it's worth thinking about that if someone asks to be accompanied, or you, of course, you can suggest it to them if you think that that's a sensible step to take. Now, the first stage in the meeting would be to inform the employee of the allegations, and it's usually a good idea simply to start by asking for the person's version of events and not leading them in any way. That gives you an opportunity, it gives them an opportunity to be open and honest, and it doesn't indicate any prior knowledge on your part, and it also prevents the employee from only describing aspects of the event that you've already been told about. So you may well learn far more if you actually just ask them to talk through what they think happened. Now, this can also help to establish what is agreed and what's disputed, which then enables the disciplinary investigator to actually concentrate on those areas. So if, for example, the employee agrees that the allegations are all correct and that, yeah, all of that did happen in this way, then that may well assist in confidentiality, as the scope of the investigation can be reduced because you may not need to talk to witnesses if they're accepting that that's actually correct. Yeah? And the less people are involved at this stage, the better. Once you've heard what the employee has to say, then it's sensible to go through a prepared list of questions, and I will say a little bit more about that shortly. Have your list of questions, but don't hand them out in advance, because that only gives the employee time to prepare an answer in line with what he or she thinks you actually want to hear. Yeah? Probe where necessary, particularly where there's likely to be any inconsistency between the witness statements and the employee's version. And if the employee denies the allegations, either altogether or in part, then ask how the information could have been misconstrued, what actions or statements might have caused a misunderstanding, and also, is there any reason for anybody to make false accusations? Now, it is easy to become flustered if the employee doesn't reply quickly to these questions, but experience shows that it is normally best to sit out the silence and wait for a response to see if one comes. Now, really listen at this point to the employee's side and demonstrate to the employee that you're doing this. Now, a lot of people will do this by repeating back some of what they're saying and saying, so I understand that this is what you say, is that right? And then you are actually repeating back, showing your understanding, showing that you're listening, and showing that you are hearing correctly. Now, the employee could be shown any documentary evidence that you have available at this stage, and for example in things like sickness records or timekeeping records, it is well worth showing them that documentary evidence at this point, because it could be that your records actually aren't accurate, and therefore somebody may be triggering a review, for example, under a Bradford factor score, which is based on the wrong amount of illness or the wrong dates, yeah, or the timekeeping record may be wrong, or they may not have done they may not have signed things or completed documents in the way that they should have done, but there may be a reason for this. And above all, stay calm. These situations are quite stressful, but the investigating officer should appear calm and neutral and reasonable throughout. That person isn't required to make any prejudgment about behaviour and no implied criticism of the employee. They are simply there to get the facts. Have a look at non-verbal behaviour if the interview is done face-to-face, and if the employee becomes emotional or cries, shouts, walks out of the room, then the notes should document this. And there is nothing to stop an investigating officer calling for an adjournment if an employee becomes angry or distressed, and giving everybody a few moments to just settle down, calm down before then continuing with the interview. Check with the employee whether there were any witnesses, if we're talking about a misconduct offence, and note any details, and then you can make arrangements to interview these people later. And ask the employee if he or she feels that there's anyone else who should be interviewed, and whether there is any other information which should be considered. Don't give personal views or opinions. The role is to investigate and to gather facts. It's not to judge. And also, whilst there is a huge temptation to do so, the officer should not make promises or hints about the outcome of the investigation. Even if you feel desperately sorry for the individual and you want to reassure them, that isn't your role. The role is to actually get the facts. Employees will very, very commonly ask whether they're going to be disciplined or what will happen next. And really the answer is to confirm that the role is one of investigation, after which a decision will be taken, and you can tell them by whom, as to what the next stage, if any, will be, and that as soon as the employee, as soon as the decision is made, that will be communicated to the employee. But an investigation meeting must never turn into a disciplinary hearing or a promise that there will not be a disciplinary hearing. So I said earlier about making a list of pre-prepared questions, and I do think that that's always a very sensible thing to do, because these meetings are stressful, not only for the employee usually, but also for the person who's asking the questions. And the better prepared you are, the easier it's going to be. So list your questions, areas of particular concern, gaps, any inconsistencies, things that don't appear quite right to you. And then look at your questions and ensure that they're actually couched in a neutral way, so that they can be asked in a calm way without showing any criticism or condemnation or leading. So, you know, what did you do? Rather than, why on earth did you do such a stupid thing? Yeah? So neutral questions. Very few closed questions, and people who are involved in recruitment interviewing will be so aware of this terminology, but closed questions are ones which would normally be answered yes or no. So they should be used sparingly and just to clarify factual information. So were you absent on the 16th of January? Had you been advised of the no smoking rule? Open questions, however, will give you far more information, and they require more detailed answers, and they're questions how, what, where, why. Talk me through. Tell me about, tell me what happened. So really you want to be having a lot of open questions and closed questions for the absolute facts that you want to check out. Yeah? Hypothetical questions, now those are the things, you know, if this situation happened again, or with hindsight, what would you do or have done differently? Now, they are generally regarded as not very useful in a misconduct situation, but they may actually indicate remorse or learning. And if someone says, oh yes, I did that, but I realise now what a stupid thing to do, and I should never have done that because now I know that the repercussions of that are this, and I now know that this is what I should do instead, then that may well affect your thinking long term as to whether disciplinary action is really warranted. So if you have remorse or learning, they can be taken into consideration. Now, silence may be golden, and it's always worth waiting and seeing whether the employee gives you more information if you just sit it out for a little while. It's also worth looking to see whether the verbal and the written information and the behaviour appears all consistent. Now again, recruiters are very aware of the halo effect or the horns effect, and that applies in this instance as well. The halo effect is where you see somebody and you really like them, and therefore you actually listen to all of their answers and try and see them in the most positive, glowing light. And the horns effect is the absolute opposite, where you dislike somebody and therefore you construe everything they say in the worst possible way. Now, a disciplinary investigation should not have either of those. So you shouldn't be attempting to make the information fit to your view. You should just be taking it at face value and trying to work out why they're saying what they are saying. So, are they afraid of retribution? Are they saying what they think you want to hear? Are they covering for somebody, or are they frightened of getting someone else into trouble? Are there any personality clashes here, or are there personality relationships that are being covered up? Why are they saying what they're saying, and why did they do what they did? Now, if your questions really don't give you an accurate view of what happened, then it's worth thinking about in the person to show you what happened and even act out or demonstrate. Take a look at the location where an incident occurred. You know, how large was it? How close were people to each other? If it's a case of somebody, and we often see this in statements, you know, he swore at me. Well, in that case, what was said? In what tone? How loud was his voice? What was the effect on you when they said that? What was the implication of it? Again, we have things like, she called me names. Well, that could mean anything, and what some people find offensive may well not be offensive to others, and also the context in which the name calling happens. So what was the name? Why did they call you names? What was the intention behind it? Now, that might not make it right, but it is relevant if you understand why they did what they did. Again, he hit me. Where? How hard? What are the relative sizes between these two people? Are we talking about one very large, strong person and one much smaller, weak individual? How close were they together? Is there any evidence of being hit, such as bruising? And if so, it may well be worth taking photographs, for example. So it's not just a case of following a checklist when you're asking questions here. We're not trying to turn you into police officers, but what we are trying to turn you into is are investigators who will be thorough and who will really try to get a good picture of what happened. So ask whatever you think is relevant to the situation in order to get a true picture. Then at that point, it's a case of preparing the employee's statement. Now, full notes should be written up as soon as possible after the interview, and if practical, get them signed to confirm they're an accurate and full record of what was said. And always include start and finishing times, who was present, what was said and how, any refusals to answer a question, and any comments or views that are made by the employee in their defence. So cover the key points of the discussion and document the facts. Once you've done that, the next stage is to think about interviewing any witnesses. So who else, if anyone, should be interviewed and in what order? Now, witnesses should be met with as soon as possible after the event while they're still fresh in the minds of those involved, and it is always sensible to talk to witnesses individually, not in groups. If there are a large number of witnesses, then very often there's not going to be any need to take statements from every single one, and it will be enough just to speak to those who are most closely involved. So it's only if their statements are inconsistent that there will be a need to interview other witnesses, unless you genuinely believe that the other witnesses may have further or more relevant information. With your witnesses, decide on the topics to cover and the order of these. But again, similar to when you're talking to the employee, it's always worth starting by asking them to recall their version of events in their own words. So have your list of questions, use your open-ended questions and more probing ones if necessary, avoid leading questions or suggesting answers, and ask the witnesses to describe how things were done or said and how they reacted to that. Now, the witnesses should not see statements made by the employee or by other witnesses unless absolutely necessary, because that could well alter their recall of the situation. But if facts do seem contradictory, then it's worth challenging the witness on the points that seem to contradict somebody else's statement and making every effort to recheck these again. if a direct quote is noted as to what's said, then that should be written down exactly as stated, repeated back to the witness and confirmed to be correct. And it's always worth asking witnesses, do they have anything else to add at the end of the meeting, because it could well be that they come out with all sorts of things that you weren't expecting. Finally, with witnesses, we would suggest that you stress the need for confidentiality with them and ask them not to discuss their statement with any other witnesses. Now, that could be a disciplinary offence if they are employees, but if they're external people such as customers or clients, then obviously you don't have any recourse over them other than to say, please can you not discuss it? We're aiming to deal with this in a professional way and we will take whatever appropriate action is necessary. And that also brings me on to another point, which is that the witnesses don't have the right to be told of the outcome of any subsequent disciplinary meeting. They may well think they've got a right to know, but in fact they haven't. That is confidential between you and the employee. When you're doing your witness statements, again, full notes of all interviews with simple and clear language, exactly as spoken by the witness. Include the full names and job titles if it's an employee of anybody who's referred to. Try to avoid jargon or acronyms, because the idea is that an outsider should be able to read and understand the statement and get a clear picture of what happened. Invite the witnesses to read through the notes and agree and sign each page of the statement. Alternatively, you can send typed up notes for signature in return, but clearly that often will delay the process. And you need to include the witness's full name and address or job title if it's a colleague. Now the pages and paragraphs, it's sensible to number those, because then it's easier for a disciplinary manager to refer to particular paragraphs at any subsequent hearing. Yep. But the other thing with witnesses very often is that they'll be quite happy to tell you things, possibly, but they do want to know that everything is going to be kept anonymous and that the employee is not going to know who has given the witness statement. Now, this might be because they're frightened about future intimidation or recriminations, but the problem is that you can't guarantee this. So the best thing to do is to advise the witness that if a case results in a disciplinary hearing or a tribunal hearing, then they may be asked to come and give evidence in person, and their anonymity can't be guaranteed unless there's a genuine and reasonable fear of reprisal. So don't give promises which you can't keep, but do take whatever steps you can to protect the witness. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as well later on. Now, you may well think about recording the meeting with the employee, but you may think differently about recording the meeting with the witnesses. First of all, this can be intimidating for some witnesses, and it can be time consuming because you end up having to type everything up in order to then highlight the key points. But a recording might be useful if you have particularly complex issues, or the witness is an external person that you can't speak to on a frequent basis, or they're geographically distanced. But you would only make a recording with the person's permission. Yeah? Witnesses may ask to record the meeting themselves, and if so, I would think very, very, very carefully about that before agreeing to such a request, especially if the witness is an external person, because it is important to take a consistent and fair approach, and at the end of the day, you don't want to find that your confidential issues are posted onto social media by the witness, because you don't have any control over the external people. So do think carefully before you agree to that. There's no real reason why a witness should need to have an electronic copy of the statement that they're giving you. So note your statements may be produced in court, so do ensure that they are professional. Now, the final step in terms of gathering evidence is to gather any other evidence or documentation that might be relevant, and to take any steps that, that you need to take to prevent it being destroyed or removed, so particularly in things like texts or emails or that sort of thing. So any relevant policies, any emails, timesheets, time records, photographic evidence, including of any injury or of any damage that's been done to your property or to people or anything else. Testing, it might well be that you want to do drugs or alcohol or substance misuse testing, in which case you should comply with your own policies on that. And it may well be that you feel the need to search lockers or desks, for example. in which case always aim to have the employee present, at the very least have an independent witness with you when you do that. And also bear in mind, if you're looking onto computers and computer usage, then you do need to comply with the Data Protection Act. So you shouldn't be opening emails that are marked private or personal unless this is actually required as relevant to the investigation. Now I'm going to have to speed up a bit because I am a little aware of the time. Criminal offences. If it seems that you're investigating a criminal offence such as theft or arson, drink driving, abuse, then you do have to ask whether the police or the health and safety executive or any other regulatory body needs to be notified. And if so, any statements or evidence that you may have used could be used in a parallel criminal investigation. If an employee admits to a criminal offence during the course of an internal investigation, then make a note of it and sign and date the statement by, get it dated and signed by both yourself and the employee. Any refusals to sign should be recorded, and if the employee disagrees with anything in the note, that should be signed and noted. And at that point, adjourn whilst you take advice and consider whether to involve any appropriate investigatory body. Now, employers are often really worried about undertaking disciplinary hearings or dismissals before the judicial system has run its course, but it could take a long time for criminal proceedings to finish, during which time your employee sits there on full paid suspension, accruing annual leave and other service-related benefits. So I won't go into that in detail here, but if you believe it reasonable to do so, then an employer may decide to carry on with the disciplinary investigation and hearing independently and make a decision before the outcome of a criminal investigation. And at the end of the day, the decision will be based on reasonable belief. Yeah? We don't have to, unlike a, excuse me, a criminal court, you don't have to prove beyond reasonable doubt that the employee is guilty. Now, step 8 involves finally bringing all your evidence together into a report with notes and evidence, with a fair and comprehensive summary at the front, yeah, showing very clearly what is factually agreed, what you haven't been able to check out or prove either way, and what is disputed. And at the end of the day, a statement as to whether formal action or informal action seems merited. So sometimes a matrix is quite useful for stating what's agreed, unsubstantiated and disputed, yeah? But you need to decide as the investigating officer which version of events you believe and also why, and include your reasoning. Now when you read your own report, are you asking questions as you read it? Do there appear to be gaps? Is it ringing any warning bells? If so, you might need to do a little bit more work. And also when you look at your report, does it appear neutral? And does disciplinary action seem merited or not? Now, what not to include in your report, and this is very important, is that your report should not include any recommendation for disciplinary action or a level of penalties. It should just be a recommendation for formal action, informal action, or no action. Yeah. So, and it also should not include recommendations for improvement for the future. Most people, when they're investigating a misconduct issue, will find some flaws in the employer's procedures or rules or policies and things that could be tightened up for the future. Now, they are very, very important, and yes, it is important to take action on those, but they should be sent as a separate report to the appropriate people, because otherwise you are highlighting the weaknesses in your case straight away to any lawyer or advisor that actually reads the disciplinary investigation report and who is advising the employee. So yes, there may well be things that need to be done for the future, but you don't include that in a disciplinary investigation report. Now, things can go wrong due to illness or absence. If they do, keep the manager and employee informed of what's happening. For example, witnesses may not be available. Explain the reason for any delay and a revised timescale. And your final stage before handing the case over is to say, is there a case to answer? Yep. If your evidence is so conflicting that it's absolutely impossible to prove what really, really happened, then it's going to be very hard to take disciplinary action on that. So it may well be that if there's no case to answer, or if you absolutely can't get to the bottom of things, that no further action should be taken against the employee, in which case discuss with the disciplinary manager who is going to notify the employee. If there is a case to answer, then you hand it all over at that point. The disciplining manager will then take over and invite the employee to a formal disciplinary hearing and will send the employee all statements and documentary evidence that you have supplied, unless there are real reasons for withholding any of this. Now, the employee has the right to see all of the evidence that will be relied on in the disciplinary hearing. But, for example, if you did have witnesses who asked to be anonymous, and if you then unearth other evidence which is actually far more persuasive and far more definite as to what happened than the witness statement, it might well be a case that you actually don't need to use that witness statement. So if your statement showed that somebody said they were at work when they weren't and they were somewhere else, but then you actually have CCTV footage proving that, you actually don't need your witness statement. That might have been a method for discovering what went on, but the further digging that you did actually gave you evidence which is far more definitive and which actually is of no risk to the witness. So consider whether some of it needs to be excluded or not. Keep your reports, keep your notes, keep your records in a secure place, and keep your handwritten notes also in case they're needed. And we're looking at least 3 but preferably 6 months following the date of a dismissal if it comes to that. Yeah. So in summary, key points, we're looking at proper planning, proper structuring of an investigation, done by an independent person, possibly suspending the employee on full pay, particularly if you're looking at potential gross misconduct and dismissal, an open mind when doing the investigation, and if the employee is interviewed, then it should be made very clear to them that the investigation is not a disciplinary hearing. And finally, the investigating officer does not have to prove things beyond reasonable doubt. So a final thought, because I am aware of the time, tribunals are often lost because of inadequate investigation, so do ensure that yours are thorough, fair and properly documented, and they'll then form the basis for a fair dismissal should it come to that. So Sue, do we have any questions at all that I can answer in the next few minutes, or is everybody stunned into silence by the amount of information we've gone through?
There's a couple I've already agreed we will deal with offline because they need a bit more information that we can probably give now. But just one other short, quick one, I think, is perhaps to just re-emphasise, does the employee have the right to be accompanied at an investigation meeting? Because it's a question we're asked a lot, isn't it, through our helpline, and clients are often not quite sure.
Yes, no, they don't have the right to be accompanied unless, and this is very rare, but unless you have a disciplinary procedure which actually allows for this, and it's a contractual procedure that you would have to follow. But other than that, there is no right to be accompanied, although you may decide it's sensible to do so, as I said before. And also there's no right to be given a particular amount of time or anything like that. I mean, employers sometimes ring us up and say, can we have letters inviting people to an investigation meeting? Well, you don't actually have to do that. All you actually have to do is say, could I have a word with you, please? Can we meet in an hour or so's time? And you don't need to give them time to prepare for that meeting.
Okay. Sounds good. I think that's all we have time for now.
Well, we've had more people at this webinar than any of our other webinars, so obviously it's a subject that that you're all interested in. We hope we've given you some useful tips and useful information. Thank you very much for joining us. We hope you'll join us in the future at future webinars, and hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.